Okay. Hello, everybody. So I'm going to go ahead and share these slides if I can. And can everybody see these slides now? Cool. I see some thumbs up. Thank you, everybody.
Yes.
All right. Today we are going to have our very first session of the 2025 Language Documentation Learning Series, co-hosted by the Endangered Languages Project and the Language Documentation Training Center at the University of Hawaii at Manoa. And I'm so happy that you're all here today to learn with us and to share a little bit about your languages, your communities, and what kind of work you're doing. So I'd like to introduce myself. Oh, but first, a couple of technical things. So each week, just this exact same time that we are meeting now, this will be happening every Friday or Saturday, depending on where you are. So, like if it is 2 a.m. in the Philippines for you, it'll be 2 a.m. next week too. And so each week we will have a different person leading a workshop about an hour long on a topic related to language documentation and revitalization. And so I would like to say, usually I am talking to you from the traditional territories of the Multnomah, Wasco, Cowlitz, Cathlamet, Clackamas, Chinook, Tualatin, Kalapuya, Molalla, and many, many other peoples who've lived and worked and cared for the lands around the Willamette and Columbia River valleys since time immemorial. And Chinook Wawa is still spoken there on the lands now known as Portland, Oregon. But today I am actually talking to you from Fez, Morocco, on the lands of the Amazigh people. And I don't know if you can hear actually the call to prayer is happening right now. And who am I? Who am I talking to you here today? My name is Anna Belew. I am the executive director of the Endangered Languages Project, and I'm also adjunct assistant professor of linguistics at the University of Hawaii at Manoa. So most of my own background and experience in this work prior to working with ELP has been in Cameroon with communities who speak Iasa, sort of on the south coast of Cameroon, and also Majumba in sort of the northwest mountains of Cameroon. And at ELP, I have the pleasure and privilege of working with communities all over the world, supporting their language work. And so just some administrative stuff to kick us off, and then we'll get into the actually interesting parts. So if you are having trouble connecting, or if this is at a really bad time of day for you, or if you have any trouble watching the live sessions, don't worry. You can go back and watch the videos of these sessions anytime after they're over. You can join the Facebook group for the learning series, or just go to our YouTube page and we'll put all the videos there. And if you want to review the slides, we'll be putting them each week in the Google Drive folder, and I will send around the link to all of those things once we're done. And so just a reminder, keep your microphone muted during the first part of this session, because otherwise we'll get a lot of microphone feedback and stuff. But at the end, we'll have some time for questions and conversation. And at the end, go ahead and turn on your mic if you want to ask something. And we have several of the wonderful ELP team here with us today. So if you have any technical problems or like you have any questions about like how to join the session or whatever, you can just comment in the Zoom chat and Eula or Pius or Amanda can probably help you out with that. Or I think Danica's here too, so we got a bunch of the ELP team here as well. And one question we often get, will I receive a certificate for doing this learning series? Yes. So if you either come to most of the live sessions or you just write to us and say, hey, I watched all the sessions, it's on the honor system. So yes, you will get a certificate. And just write to us if you're not able to come and we'll get you a certificate as well. And now we can actually talk about language stuff now that we're done with all the administrative things. So let's get started with a little pop quiz. Not really a quiz, there's no grades. But how many languages do you think exist in the world today? And I'm going to see if anybody in the chat knows this because I think each year people just kind of know by now. 7,000. Yep, more than 7,000. Yep, you guys are on it. You know the answer here. Yeah, so as far as we know, there are approximately 7,000 languages. And that's, again, that's kind of the best estimate by linguists. It could be significantly more than that, depending on how you count. But a lot of those languages are not spoken by very, very many people. In fact, most languages in the world are spoken by pretty small communities, or at least small numbers of people speak them. So one kind of estimate that people often cite is that 96% of people in the world speak about 4% of the languages in the world. So that means 96% of people on Earth speak these like really huge languages like Arabic or Spanish or English or French or Mandarin, like the really, really big ones. And then the vast majority of all the languages on Earth have pretty small communities of speakers, so it's actually really normal to have a small speaker community. So, when we talk about this term endangered, it's kind of a word we have to stop and unpack for a minute because I think for a lot of people, especially maybe in the past, like the prior to 5 or 10 years ago, a lot of people would hear this word endangered and they would think like, oh, endangered species, like, oh, I'm thinking of pandas, I'm thinking of a certain kind of eagle, right? But uh, a lot of times, this term endangered has also been used to describe languages. And this means something sort of similar to, say, a species being endangered, right? It's a concept that was borrowed from that like biological sciences world. And we do want to say there are problems with using this term. There are a lot of communities that really don't prefer using this term to refer to their languages. And it has some connotations that really don't fit very well or can be pretty problematic. But there are other communities that choose to use this term. There are a lot of like government bodies, academic programs, funders, and that so on that do use this word, and it's like a very commonly known term. So I'm going to use it today because it's a word or a framing that a lot of people are already familiar with. But if you want to sort of dive more into writing and thinking about how we talk about language loss, there's a link to a previous video, and we'll also share some other resources in the Google Drive. So, that said, using this term endangered for our purposes today, what does that actually mean? Well, basically, it means that there's a risk that a language might no longer be spoken. Maybe very soon, maybe a few generations from now, but there is some kind of danger that a language might fall silent, right? That no one will actively be using it. And that's not theoretical. There are hundreds and hundreds of languages that we know of just within the last 50 or 60 years that have fallen silent, right? That previously were used by communities or by individuals, maybe at some point, and then now, today, they may not have anyone using them anymore. And if we look at the really big picture, as far as we can tell, this process of language loss, language endangerment, it's happening faster and more broadly now than at any time ever before in human history, right? This crisis of language silencing is at its peak and accelerating right now in our times. So that means that if we look at all of these 7,000-ish languages on Earth, almost half of them are currently endangered. And there are a lot of ways to kind of measure this or to try and guess at what percentage of languages are facing these risks. But the one that ELP uses is called the Catalog of Endangered Languages, which is a resource created by the University of Hawaii. And based on their way of measuring language endangerment, we're looking at about 46% or more of all human languages that are currently endangered. So this is a really serious global crisis. This is not something limited to one part of the world. This is happening everywhere, and it's happening more and more. So, which brings us to the question, obviously, why, right? When we learn about a global crisis, I think for many of us, our first instinct is to go, why is this happening? And then what can we do about it? So, the first thing that I generally like to say when we're talking about language endangerment is to try and combat some myths that sometimes you hear about why languages might be silenced. And this is something that, linguists have been talking about for 80-ish years. So way back in 1948, Morris Swadesh, the linguist, was saying, in very linguisty terms, the factors determining obsolescence of language are non-linguistic. But okay, let's put that in normal people words. This means that languages don't become endangered because of things like they are too complicated or too simple, right? Coming from a linguist's perspective, there is no such thing as a language that's too complicated or too simple to learn or to use, right? All human languages serve the purposes that their communities need them for. And any human kid can learn any human language, right? You teach any baby any language, they will learn it pretty much exactly the same. And that means there's no such thing as a language really that's too hard to learn. Any baby can learn any language. If you're having transfer of language from one generation to another, any language can be transferred that way. Similarly, at least from a linguist's perspective, no language is more logical or more beautiful or, I don't know, more reasonable than another. Like I said, all languages basically serve the needs of their communities. They've adapted over thousands of years and many, many generations to do what people need them to do. And so, yeah, you might personally find a language the most beautiful, or you might think it has a really logical way of describing things. But that's just kind of opinion. It's personal aesthetics. It doesn't mean that one language is better than another in an objective way. And this gets into another discourse that hopefully we're hearing less and less of now, but you still hear it. Sometimes people will say horrible stuff like, oh, that language is too primitive. It's not fit for the modern world. There's no word for email, garbage like that. Again, linguistically speaking, none of that is true. A language that is spoken in 2025 is obviously fit for the modern world because it is being spoken in 2025. And in fact, any language, even if it's currently silent, if people begin speaking it again, it will work perfectly well for the modern world. Every single language has to change and grow and add new things as the world changes. English has to borrow words like crazy. Every single language invents new terms, changes, adapts, right? So there's no such thing as a language that hasn't changed and adapted to fit the world. And so, all that said, I just want to really drive home the point that a language doesn't become endangered because of the language itself, right? It has nothing to do with the actual language or its grammar or its sounds or anything like that. So, this probably leaves us with the obvious question, well, then what? If it's not the language, what is it? And the answer, obviously, is social systemic issues. Language endangerment is a social issue. It's a thing to do with people and the systems they live in. And so things that affect those people and those communities where the language is used is actually what causes language endangerment. And conversely, what you can work on to do language revitalization, right? So, what are some of these issues? And I want to say first, this is me coming from my background as a linguist trained in Western academia, me being primarily an English speaker, right? So this is just sort of me coming from that background. There are a lot of different ways to think and talk about this, and I am bringing only one of them. So please, this is not the be all end all of ways to think about language endangerment. But if we were to try to put things into categories, sometimes that helps people think through things. One big category is sometimes it's called physical factors, which is really bad stuff that happens to people or that people do to each other. And so these are factors that affect the physical well-being or survival of the communities who use languages, right? So this includes stuff like genocide, colonialism, wars, diseases, natural disasters, forced cultural disruption or relocation, forced assimilation, right? The really bad, horrible things that can happen to a community. And these are unfortunately extremely common causes of language endangerment, right? When bad things happen to a community, when people are really severely destabilized, you see language being destabilized or lost or suppressed too. Not in every case. This isn't every single case of language endangerment, but it's pretty common. And then, of course, right, there are economic factors that can really strongly affect people's use and transmission of their languages. And this can include kind of like people needing to migrate to other places to earn a living or to survive, urbanization, so either people moving to cities or their towns growing into cities over time, and maybe having people who speak other languages or maybe more presence of a more dominant group that forces a language to be used in that area. And this also has a lot to do with the destruction or dispossession of people's lands and livelihoods, right? If previously, everybody in your community had a really stable, good life farming something that you survived off of, and that no longer was possible due to climate change, due to environmental degradation, whatever it is, that's really going to change how you live. And if you have to change how you live, you might have to change the language use in your life, right? And all of this, again, has to do with people's need to survive and have a decent life. And when that's disrupted, when that's taken away, language loss often follows. And again, this is one of those things that's usually present in communities facing language endangerment, but not always, but pretty much almost always there's something going on there. And of course, political and legal factors can play a really big role in language endangerment too. Um, Really direct government suppression has happened for many centuries, right? Sometimes languages are outlawed, either in specific contexts, like it's illegal to use this language in schools, or even today, there are still places on Earth where it is illegal to use certain languages at all. But it's not always that obvious or that direct, right? There can also be policies that are really, really bad for the speakers of a language to be able to use their language, right? They might not be illegal, but it could be very difficult to use your language in courts or in schools. Sometimes resources are not distributed by governments in ways that support the use of a language. There could be violations of people's language rights. There could be lack of the autonomy for a community to choose what language they use. So, all kinds of, again, really difficult, bad stuff that happens to communities that really strongly affect their languages. And there are lots of cases of this having direct effects on people and communities. So, a really tragic example a few years ago, an Udmurt speaker in the Russian state actually committed suicide in front of the state council building in his province in protest of government policies that would have taken his language out of the educational system. So, this isn't theoretical, it has really powerful effects on real people in real life. And then we get into much more difficult to quantify, very complicated personal, social factors like people's attitudes, right? What do people think is an important language? What do people think is a language that will help them access power, right? What do people think is the language that will give their children a shot at a more economically successful life? And this has a lot to do with maybe shame or prestige or a sense of identity or in the inverse, right, a sense of repressed identity. There are lots of things about people's feelings around their languages, their attitudes to their languages that can mix into all these other things and change the way they use their languages. So if you've ever heard anybody say like, "Oh, I just taught my kids English because I want them to go to a good school," that's the kind of attitude that you'll often find in language endangerment contexts. And that's almost always there in some way, but always in complicated and nuanced ways. But I think the most important thing is none of these are really distinct categories. They all blend together, they all weave together in different ways, depending on where in the world you are, what kind of history you're coming from, what kind of, socio-political context you're in now. Most communities that are facing challenges to their language vitality are dealing with most or all of these things at once. They're all linked together in really core ways. So I'm going to pause there and check the chat, make sure everything is still going okay.
Um,
Yeah.
Anna,
Yes.
did you plan to share slides?
Oh my
Um,
goodness. Are y'all not
yeah,
seeing the slides?
no, not yet. So,
How terrible. Thank you for letting me know, Pius.
mhm.
All right. So you've just been looking at me talk. How embarrassing. All right. So we got some slides here. Now we will have them for the rest of the session. And I will be sure to share these going forward. So that said, I want to pause and say, again, one of these discourses that sometimes come up when people are talking about language endangerment, it's really important not to blame people or communities who have had their languages taken away, right? Sometimes you'll hear people say stuff like, oh, well, if they're choosing to go use another language, that's fine. That's just progress, whatever. You may hear things like that. But it feels very much like victim blaming, right? Most of the time, when a community's language has been taken away, has been repressed, has been made difficult to use in some way, um, it's not necessarily a free choice. It's at best a choice between unjust or not very good options, right? If you're being forced to choose between your language, your culture, your identity, or like making money and in order to feed your kids, or maybe even stay free or not go to jail, that's not really a free choice per se. And so again, this is a really complicated issue, and we welcome y'all to discuss it respectfully with each other. Or if you want to talk more about it, you can make an appointment with any of ELP's language revitalization mentors. They're happy to talk through some of this complicated stuff with you. But again, really, I don't think it's ever truly a free choice for a community to move to another language and lose their language entirely. It's at best a not very free choice. So, in general, there's a quote I really, really love that kind of encapsulates all this. Uh, as a rule of thumb, language endangerment doesn't happen when everything's fine in a community, when everything's stable and cool. So, Chickasaw scholar Jenny L. Davis puts it this way that language loss is tied to the decline or demise of indigenous sovereignty or autonomy, the loss of political, economic, or geographic stability and power, or even the strong correspondence of language attrition, that is, language endangerment, language loss, with the actual necropolitical dynamics in marginalized communities. And we'll unpack that a little bit. It's slightly academic language, but she's saying that the language loss is really closely linked to the things that cause suffering and death in human communities, right? It's not just something that's sort of like an aesthetic loss. This is tied to oppression, this is tied to colonization, this is tied to human suffering. And so, it's very closely linked to people's well-being, which is why it's so important that all of us work to shift this tide of language loss, that all of us do what we can to support communities in keeping their languages strong. And so it's not really also a question of endangered versus not endangered. Sometimes you hear like, this one's fine, this one's endangered. It's not really quite like that. If we had to try and visualize language endangerment as a scale, it's really kind of more like a three-dimensional cloud with lots of different factors. But if we want to try and put it at least on a scale, it can go all the way from sort of the most severe, the most critical of situations, which is when a language is dormant. That is, there aren't any people living today who can still use the language, right? You may see terms like extinct. It's not a good term to use because a language often can come back. It can wake up, even if there aren't any people who still speak it today. So we say dormant or sleeping to represent the fact that a language can be awakened. It can wake back up and come back into the community. And then when we look at really, again, quite severe situations, we have cases where the community may just have a handful of people who still speak, right? This is the case for a lot of languages in North America today, but also in other parts of the world. There might just be, maybe 10, 20, 50 people who can still use the language. Um, then kind of in the middle grounds, we have still, pretty serious situations, but where there are more people who can use the language, including some kids. So the community where I have worked for the last several years, in Iyasa country, there are about 2,000 people who can speak. So on the catalog of endangered languages scale, we might call this threatened, kind of the middle ground. And then we also have languages that are big. They have big communities, but they're still facing some challenges to their vitality, right? So in Indonesia, for example, the Sasak language has about 2 million speakers, but there are still really serious challenges to using and passing on that language. So in the catalog of endangered languages, they might call that at risk, kind of the least severe, but still endangered at risk language category. And language contexts don't really just move in one direction on this scale, right? Over the years, a language might be facing more challenges and then move into a better position, right? So, a really wonderful example that gives a lot of hope to a lot of people is one language that proves that languages can wake up even if they're sleeping, even if they haven't had speakers for hundreds of years. The Mia language was sleeping for, I think, about 180 years. There was no one living who was a regular user of the language. But today, after a lot of really, really hard work by the community, there are now children being raised in Mia. And this means that the language has awakened, is being used again, is being taught, is being learned, is being passed on, and is just being part of people's lives again. So, this is not sort of something where once you're on this scale, you're moving towards dormancy. No, no, there's definitely room to come back. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in future weeks. And again, this whole thing of like trying to assess language context using numbers or scales is also pretty problematic and not always accurate. It's too complicated a thing to measure in a even on a scale or a set of numbers. So I'll put some really helpful readings about that in our Google Drive folder and on the Facebook group. But I'm trying not to get too in depth here. This is just week one, so let's start off. Uh, and so hopefully, if you're here, most of us already agree that indigenous and endangered and minoritized languages matter. They matter. This is not just something that maybe linguists are worried about because they're nerds about languages. This is about human well-being. This is about people's rights. This is about people's cultural identity. This is about people's relationships with each other, their lands, their histories. And there are so many reasons that languages matter to people. So I invite all of you to reflect on why your language matters to you, why it matters to the people around you, in your family, in your community, in your country, and also to reflect a little bit about which aspects of language feel most important or close to you, and which parts you might want to focus on safeguarding for the future, right? Because that's what we're doing your series, language documentation, is helping to safeguard languages for future generations, for people in the years to come, and also for people now who might want to learn or get closer to their language. These are just some of the reasons that people often Yeah. Some of the reasons people often cite for why their languages are so important to them are their cultural and spiritual and social identities, their literal health and well-being, right? There's a lot of research showing that when languages are healthy, People have better physical health, they have lower rates of diabetes, they have better general health. Mental health is improved, social health as well. People have a stronger sense of belonging to their community, a better sense of identity, and spiritual health, right? They feel more as if they are connected to their world, their lands, their identities, and sort of the greater universe. This is also a human rights issue, right? The United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples declares very clearly that Indigenous peoples have the right to use, maintain, transmit, and develop their own languages. There's also a very useful plain language statement on understanding and defending language rights, created by the Global Coalition for Language Rights. So check that out. I'll share a link. If you're coming at this from sort of a research or scholarly perspective, there as well as, a perspective of respecting and acknowledging all of the knowledge is held in language, there is no way to quantify all of the knowledge that is contained and transmitted and passed on through language, right? Language and knowledge and understandings of the world are completely woven together. You can't just take out the knowledge from a language and replace it in some other language, right? It's inherently woven in. And so when a language is taken away from people, so is so much knowledge about the world, about how to exist, and about, things that have been passed on for thousands and thousands of years. And then, of course, if you care about arts and humanities, you're also losing an incredible body of art, poetry, literature, music, right? All of the ways that we express being human. And this is also so inextricably woven into language. So basically, I hope I don't have to convince any of you that languages matter, but just in case you ever have to go out into the world and explain to someone else why language is so important, you might find some use in some of these ways of framing it. This is not just me saying this is not just all of us. This is acknowledged by the United Nations. We are currently in the International Decade of Indigenous Languages. We are in the third year, or no, fourth, two, three, four, five, fourth year of the International Decade of Indigenous Languages. And this is the UN sort of sanctifying this decade to support and uplift and grow efforts to protect and uplift Indigenous languages. So, while yes, this is the most challenging time for language diversity in the whole history of humanity, this is also a really good time for languages because communities around the world are working really, really hard to reclaim and revitalize and document their languages. There's a lot of hope to be found, and we're going to be talking more about language revitalization in coming weeks. And there is so much good work happening. So I encourage all of you to go to the ELP website, check out our new global map of revitalization programs, share about what you're doing in your community, and just help keep each other inspired and give space to learn from her. So one thing that we can that, you know, in the face of this crisis and distinguish from pollution and other activities, even though they're very closely related. I am getting a message that my internet connection is unstable. Am I frozen?
You're back
Maybe
now.
not. Okay, I'm going to
Hear
keep
you.
going just in case y'all can. I'm back.
We can hear
Awesome.
you.
Yay.
Fine again.
Perfect. Okay.
We can hear you. Continue.
So, I have an active field. So, language documentation, in the words of one very influential paper, is creating a purpose record of a language. And we'll pack that about this from the perspective of what academic linguistic subfield of language documentation. However, this is not work that's just for Western academics. Anybody can do this, and I think it's really important that more and more people begin the work of creating good records of their language to support which them can be useful to your community. So I hope you'll take everything I'm saying today and think about how to adapt it and make it most relevant and most useful to you and your community. Yep, so there's no one right way to do this. I'm going to share some of the ways that I've learned, and if they're useful to you, awesome. So, what exactly is it when we're doing language documentation in a practical sense? Well, when we say a lasting multi-purpose record, we want to create records lots of different aspects of it as people use it. And so this includes like the sounds, the grammar, the way, the some of the important phrases people use, the way conversations are structured. And importantly, we're going to talk more about this in week 6. It doesn't have to be focused on just one language. This can definitely include the other languages used in a community. Many communities are really multilingual. And so when you're documenting a language, it's absolutely fine and great to include other languages that are used in your community. Um, in a perfect world, you would be able to use good quality recording equipment, whether video recording or audio recording, to have as good a quality of sound and images as possible, right? If you are making a recording of something really important, you don't want it to be all blurry. You don't want there to be a lot of noise. You want to be able to really hear or see what you're trying to record. Another aspect of language documentation often includes archiving, and that doesn't always necessarily mean like at a university or a museum. Archiving can refer to any plan to keep language materials safe and accessible to your community for a really long time, right? You don't want to just put an important recording on a flash drive and then like drop that flash drive in the river and it's ruined because there goes your recording. So, archiving in a broad sense is making sure that what you create, these precious materials, are able to be accessed by your community for a really long time. And in some cases, it also can include studying your language, right? Trying to understand patterns, maybe in your sounds or the grammar you use, or the ways people talk to each other. So, thinking about what to document, I think can be really intimidating when you're getting started because when you say I'm going to record my language, well, that's huge. A whole language would take, I don't know, 1,000 years to really record the entire thing. So, we have to sort of prioritize and think practically about what it is that people often record. So, some good starting points that a lot of people find useful would be recording lists of words and sentences and what they mean. And I think this is the sort of thing a lot of folks think about when they think language documentation. They think, I'm going to record vocabulary lists, I'm going to ask people to translate sentences. And that's a really good starting point, right? That's a great place to begin. But it's not everything. There's so much more to language than just that. And so it's also really important to include conversations, speeches, right? Jokes, stories, all the different ways people talk, whether to each other or, if someone's giving a speech at a wedding, if somebody's being really mean to someone else, all of this stuff is important parts of how people use language. Recipes, instructions, proverbs, songs, this can all be a really crucial part of what you gather in your language documentation. And so, if you ask a documentary linguist, should I include this in my recordings? They'll probably say, yeah, all language is important. Include all of it, right? All of it's precious. So, again, let's get practical because I don't want to overwhelm y'all. Good places to start include basic records of things like the sounds that are used in a language, or if you're working with a sign language, the hand shapes. So, words obviously get as much vocabulary as possible, or if you want to use the linguistic term, the lexicon. You could also look at and try and make good records of the ways words are built in your language or the ways they get turned into other words, right? So how, if I'm documenting English, how do I get running from the word run? Or how do I turn computer out of compute, right? So we might call this morphology of your language. You could also try and get records of the ways we put words together to make sentences. So if I'm trying to say, like, my computer won't run, how do I know what order to put those words in to make a good sentence in English? So we can call that the syntax. And then as we grow out this focus, we also want to look at the ways we put sentences together to make things like conversations or speeches or stories. And so that includes fields like discourse analysis. And then, of course, we want good examples of people actually using the language, people living their lives and doing stuff that they do with the language. So, conversations between real people, people telling stories, people telling jokes, right? And in old school language documentation, this was called texts, which is kind of odd because often this is spoken, not written. But if you see reference to texts in language documentation, they usually mean like longer chunks of people talking. And then, if you want to get really specialized, you can do documentation work about anything around language. And these are nearly infinite in the topics you can focus on. So, some actual examples from studies I really think are cool. You could look at special vocabulary people use when they're hunting. You could look at how different groups of people pronounce things differently. You could learn how kids learn certain parts of the grammar in your language. For example, I had a colleague who looked at how kids learn how to make plurals on nouns, right? You could also look at multilingualism and what languages people use, right? Do people use the same languages in this town and this town? Do older people and younger people know the same languages? All that's great for documentation. You could look at how people make songs in languages that have tones. So all this stuff is, there's an infinite diversity of things you could look at when you're working in documentation. And this is probably going to be a long-term process for most of you. It will take many, many, many years. The work is never done. So you could focus on so many things over time as you're doing language documentation. And so that can be kind of overwhelming. All of this stuff is included in language documentation. And in a perfect world, you could document everything, right? You could record all kinds of conversations and words and stories, but we have limited time. We have to respect the fact that we are just humans. We have 24 hours in our day. We have to make some decisions about what to document. And so the first thing that it might be helpful to do is decide on the goals of your documentation work right now. And what outcomes are you hoping for? And who are you hoping to do this work for? So are you mostly hoping to create materials for example, people learning the language, either right now or in the future, and people who don't know the language yet? So that might make you want to focus on sort of basic introductory conversation kind of recordings. Or maybe you're hoping to create materials for people who do know the language now, but maybe they want to learn more about special kinds of speech, or they want to learn certain vocabulary that they don't know. Are you hoping to make materials to do research in linguistics or anthropology or whatever? Maybe you're a researcher and you want to create records for your own career in your community. Are you hoping to maybe look at how your language interacts with biology or ecology or other kinds of knowledge about land or plants or animals, right? What else is your audience? Who are you making these recordings for? And what is your interest, right? And that will sort of guide you to what you want to make to start with. So maybe you hope your documentation can make learner's guides or learner's grammars, or maybe materials for people to listen to practice their language. Maybe you want to make recordings to give to people's family members or descendants so that they can listen to what their ancestors were saying. Maybe you've been asked to make a dictionary. Maybe you want to make a recipe book. Maybe you want to make like a YouTube playlist of songs in your language. All of these things are great things to work towards. So it's really up to you what you want to focus on and what would be most useful to your community right now. And one of the misconceptions I think sometimes people have is that documentation is just recording a bunch of stuff and throwing it in a box somewhere and leaving it there. But that's not all of it. If we're thinking about documentation as an academic field, it's really the language as it's being used and the knowledge that people have about that language, right? The relationships between like a recording and then maybe your analysis of the sounds in the recording. But it's also about the relationship between, like, let's say you record a conversation. It's about who is in that room, what is their relationship to each other, where are they talking, right? Like, whose house are they at? What time of day is it? It's about the context and the people as well as sort of the analysis of the language. So if you make a recording, great, that's a good part of documentation, but there's so much more to do once you have made that recording. And you can make lots of stuff. You can make dictionaries, you can make language corpora, you can, do a lot of like linguistic analysis, you can do software stuff. I won't get too deep into that, but there's so much you can do with just one good recording. It can turn into so many things. And so get creative, right? Even if you only have the opportunity to, I don't know, record a few stories, you can do so many things with those few stories to help folks in your communities learn or practice or otherwise, use those. Um, I also want to say that the things you make or the outcomes of your documentation work aren't the only or the most important part of this work. Documentation really is about the process of making all these records. And how you do this work is as or more important than the outcomes of the work, right? So just by doing documentation, you can and hopefully will be honoring and elevating the knowledge and expertise of the people who are sharing this language, who are recording it, who know the language. And it can also really go a long way towards increasing the prestige or the visibility of your language, right? If your language has been ignored or marginalized or erased, documentation can help lift it up and say, like, look, we're here. This is our language. It needs to be honored and respected. And you need to be aware that we are here. Uh, but also the act of documentation, the process, the work can also really build a lot of strong relationships or strengthen them, right? When you're documenting language, you're spending a lot of time with people, you're talking together, you're learning things together. And this can really deepen relationships within your community. It can build bonds with the people you're working with. And especially, it can also, if you haven't had the chance to learn some of the things you're documenting, you can learn a lot about maybe your own language, your own culture, the knowledge held in your community through the process of language documentation. So it can be really good for you as the document. And so I want to encourage all of you to give a lot of care and attention to how you do this work, not just what you're producing in the end, right? Be really thoughtful about how you're doing this work to strengthen positive relationships, to honor and respect the people you're working with, and to lift up the language keepers who you're talking to. It's all about how you're doing this. And on that note, I want to stop and go back because remember when I said anything you want to record, that's great. That's a great idea. There are some big, big exceptions. We don't ever, ever, ever document things that are not okay to document, right? And I hope I don't have to say this. I hope that's just super obvious. But if something is not okay to record, just don't do it. Don't ever try and push past the preferences or stated protocols of the people you're working with. If you know or you are told that something is secret, that something should not be recorded, that something is not okay to share, respect that 100% full stop always. Don't ever try to push on it. Especially if you are working in a community other than your own, your job is to learn your role, invited to do, and take extreme care to abide by those protocols and those permissions. Okay. And if you want to learn more and read some of the incredible Indigenous thinkers who have written about this stuff, there's a very long list of citations. I will share all of these papers with you. All right, so we've talked a bunch about documentation, creating all these records, the ways we can create these records, what they're for. But you might be thinking, okay, so I've got all these records and I want to use them to revitalize my language. Good, awesome. Yes, I'm glad you're thinking that to yourself. So, we're going to talk about revitalization a bit more at the end of this series, and we're going to also invite all of you to apply for ELP's spring program, Ready to Revitalize, which is entirely focused on language revitalization. But I want to talk some about the relationship between documentation and revitalization, because they're not separate things, they are not unrelated to each other. Documentation can be a really core part of revitalization, right? For example, when I talked about Miamia, the language that was sleeping for a long time and now has woken up, that was partly possible because there was good documentation. And so these records can be immediately used, like tomorrow, to help create learning materials, to help support revitalization. And they can also be good to have in the long term as sort of a safety net if, God forbid, one day there's no one who knows your language. If you have all these records that you made in the past, that can help the language come back. So this can be a really important thing to have for the future. And if we want to kind of summarize what these two things are, if we compare them, documentation is generally about creating records of a language, and then revitalization is more about creating a context where people can use the language, right? Helping people use it more in their life and in more people in more parts of their life. And so, is documentation only for languages that are endangered? Is a question we also sometimes get, right? Like, my language is pretty strong, people use it all the time. Should I bother documenting it? And the answer is like, yes, absolutely. Even if your language is pretty strong, if there are a lot of speakers, it could still probably use documentation. If your language is not English, Mandarin, Arabic, French, German, Spanish, Russian, Japanese, Korean, or maybe like Hindi and Bengali, your language probably does not have all of the resources that these really big languages do. If you can't, for example, use all of the software you want to in your language, your documentation work could help make that process more possible, right? Your documentation work could help create TV shows or albums or podcasts in your language. You could help edit your Wikipedia. You could help, make a phone interface in your language. All of this could be really useful. So even if you're saying my language isn't endangered, should I bother? Yeah, there's also stuff you can be doing for your language. So, that was a lot, but I think the way I want to end this is just to say language documentation can be so helpful to your community and to your language. And so it's fine if this is all sounding a little overwhelming, because over the next 9 weeks, we're going to be all learning together some ways that you can get started in really practical, concrete ways. And so, with that said, I want to open it up, stop talking at you, and let's have some questions. I'm going to stop sharing for now. And I'm first going to look in the chat. Maybe there have been some questions. But if anybody else wants to just raise their hand or drop questions in the chat, please feel free to. All right, I see a hand up. Yeah, Leah, is that right?
Hi, yeah. Do you hear me right? Yeah. Hi. So I'm from Peru, Lima, or Lima, Peru, and I'm studying linguistics. I'm 1 year left to graduate, and well, my interest is endangered languages and the process and projects of revitalization. So I wanted to know, so for my thesis, let's say, I want to document or to analyze morphosyntactically, let's say. I don't know how to say it, I'm sorry. English is not my first language, but this Amazonian language that's Yawa, and has like 3,000 speakers or so. Very little, very a little population. And so I wanted to know, I'm not Yawan, I'm not from that community, and I wanted to know what is or how it would be the method to document a community that you're not part of that community, to so it's not very intrusive, or it can lead to not a negative, let's say, contact or negative presentation. And so yeah, so how would it be?
Yeah. Oh, thank you so much. That's a really, really important question. And I imagine it might resonate with some other folks in the room. So, I think the first thing is relationships. The first place you need to start is building good relationships, and finding out what the community wants from you, what they're interested in working with you on, and if they're interested in working with you at all. So I'd say the first thing to do is really to introduce yourself, to say, hi, I'm a linguistics student. I would love to do some work together on whatever topics you feel confident or able to support them with. But I think really the first thing is just to listen and to ask, would you like to work with me? Is there anything that you would like to work with a student on? And if so, what is it? How can I support you? These are the skills I have. Do any of those sound useful to you? So I think, and then just sort of just get to know people, right? Go slowly, take the time to build relationships, because the only way that it works is if there's good relationships of trust and sort of mutual understanding and benefit. And so there's a lot more to say there. It's hard to just talk about that briefly. So I'd like to share a resource that my wonderful colleague, Dr. Amanda Holmes, and I wrote a couple of years ago. It's called A Linguist's Code of Conduct, Guidelines for Engaging in Linguistic Work with Indigenous Peoples. And it's meant to be a pretty accessible resource just to guide conversations and thoughts about how to build those good relationships so that everyone benefits from the work you do together. And actually, maybe Danica or Eula or somebody, if you can grab that link and drop that in. Aha, Federico, thank you. Yep, there it is in the chat, and I'll put that in the Google Drive also. Yeah, so that's just the beginner's version, and feel free to make an appointment with any of the language revitalization mentors as well. They would all be wonderful folks to talk to about that. All right, I think next up was Ishmael.
Hey, good evening from my end.
Hello.
Good evening.
Yeah, we're hearing you. Go ahead. What's your
Yeah.
question?
Okay, thank you for the presentation. It was very informative, and I commend you for that. Mine is not really a question. I am a master's student in linguistics, and I think my interest is in language contact, or see multilingualism or language contact. And currently, my thesis, I am done with my thesis, but then it has been submitted to external for external assessment. So whilst I wait on the external assessment, I am looking for, mentors who are into language contact or multilingualism, so that we can, if possible, collaborate for a joint project. Because I have some communities here that I would love to, work with or work on. So if there are any mentors here that are into language contact or multilingualism, they can avail themselves so that I reach out to them. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you for sharing. And I think also, Ishmael, it would be helpful maybe for you to make an appointment with any of the language revitalization mentors because they have lots of knowledge about ways to look at languages in contact with each other. So we definitely invite you to chat with them. And thanks, Danica. She just dropped a link in there to make a free appointment to talk with any of the mentors. All right,
Oh,
next up, I think next person to raise their hand was Shushanak, and I'm so sorry if I pronounced that wrong.
You pronounced that perfectly right. Thank you. And Anna, thank you so much. This is not the first year that I've been participating, but you always share so many insights that I feel really, really inspired. I'm from far away Armenia, and my language itself is not endangered, luckily, I know. But at the same time, I would like to ask you about a specific point that you noted. It was very interesting that you said that language endangerment is at its peak, because, and maybe I fall into a stereotype here, and apologies if that sounds offensive, but just for my knowledge, I would like to learn from you whether, or from anyone else who knows about that, why, whether language endangerment really is at its peak. Because in my belief, which may be a stereotype, language endangerment was much more when the word even didn't exist. 100 years ago, 200 years ago, 300 years ago, when there was so much colonization. I mean, my language has, in a way, miraculously survived because Armenia didn't have independence. And I think that it was much more endangered in the past, even though I understand that's not the same history everywhere in the world. I'd like to know if there is anything about the history of endangerment that we know, because, well, it is a relatively new branch of linguistics if we consider in that light. So I'd just like to enlighten myself more. Thank you so much.
That is a great question, because this is one of those statistics that it's hard to make, right? It's very difficult to make claims about like human history broadly and like what we know about languages over all of history. And so that sort of statistic comes from a book chapter in a 2018 book. I'll send a link by me and Sean Simpson, and it's based on our limited knowledge of languages that have been lost over the past 500 to 700 years. There are other linguists who look in a broader scope at like all of human history and what they call like the punctuated equilibrium model of languages coming into being and then going out of existence and blah, blah, blah. But as far as we know, human language diversity has been somewhat stable over a lot of human history because people lived in relatively small communities. Multilingualism was pretty widespread, and there wasn't a really global system that was widely forcing people to shift to just a few major languages, right? The term globalization is really too broad and too imprecise to mean to be meaningful when we're talking about language revival or to language endangerment. But um, let's see, how do I not get too deep into the academic weeds here? The current colonial capitalist world system over the past 500 years has created sociopolitical conditions in which language shift has accelerated to a degree that almost certainly has never happened before. So I'll send you a couple of chapters about how that claim came to be. Um, but it's basically our best guess, right? This could have happened before, but probably very unlikely that the world has ever been like it is now. The way the world is now is really rough on languages, and this is probably the worst it's ever been. Maybe not, but probably. Yeah. Oh, okay. Sorry, that was a complicated one. I think Maria had her hand up next.
Hello, thank you. I have a very practical question. I'm going to be the bridge between people who are native speakers of the languages that are endangered. They don't speak English, so they have no access to these workshops. So I want to be of help. And I was wondering if there are documents that you've produced that could help us as guidance.
Yes. Oh, that's a wonderful question. And thank you so much for sort of helping make this knowledge more accessible to people who don't speak English. That's something that we at ELP would like to do more of, but we're limited by the fact that most of our shared language on the team is English. So I'm guessing, but please correct me, is Spanish the language that would be useful to have resources in?
That's correct. The people that I'm working with are from Peru and Mexico.
Okay, awesome. We do have some good resources in Spanish, sort of basic information about language documentation and practical guidelines for doing it. There is,
It's not
see.
if the documents are in English, that wouldn't be a problem
Oh,
because
okay.
I'm happy to help them with translations.
Okay, amazing. Then there's a really wonderful new guide that came out a couple years ago called Safeguarding Your Language Through Documentation. It's in English. I think it's also in French now, but translating that should be pretty doable. And there's also a short book in Spanish, actually, just sort of practical guidance for language documentation that I will also put in the Google Drive folder.
That
And I'll also share some English materials that feel free to translate. And if you do translate them, please, if you're comfortable, send them back to ELP. Share them through our resource library so that other Spanish speakers can benefit.
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah.
The idea is to spread this. So thank you so much. This is, well, what they're planning to do is to document, but also generate materials that are focused on kids, children, educating them and revitalizing the language because of the many reasons that you mentioned before. The languages they speak are slowly, disappearing. So if that can help us or help me help them, that's fantastic. And yeah, when I get the documents translated, I'll share them. Thank you so much.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. I hope those documents can be useful.
Yeah.
Um, Next, I think Peter had his hand up next.
Yes, good morning, everyone. Good morning, Dr. Laura. My question would be more onto going to the site. Links have been shared here, and one thing that interested me the most is that there is meeting the mentors. I was like wondering this time, like I'm currently working on Kinamigin language in Southern Philippines. It's under threatened in status. Along the way, I would love to, I don't know, along the way, would mentors help me out in furthering my documentation process? And as regards to the concerns of having it stored, publication possibility and accessibility to the natives themselves, would that be possible?
Yeah, absolutely. That is exactly what the mentors are here for, to help you with your documentation and revitalization work. So definitely we invite you to make an appointment, make as many as you want. Talk to all the mentors. They all have different knowledge and expertise and backgrounds.
All right, thank you very much. And I also just PM'd you earlier. Hope you could check that out. Thank you,
Oh,
Dr.
yes. Awesome. We'll take a look
Anna.
at that. Yeah. Cool. And let's see, I think Loretta's hand was up next.
Yeah, hi, good evening. Hi,
Oh,
Anna. Hi, hi. So I want to ask, I'm pretty new in the whole language revitalization thing. Um, but I'm from a community in Nigeria where it's a multilingual community and most of the languages there are kind of endangered. And I want to start a conversation about it, starting from the awareness, because the current speakers there are not even aware that the language is, endangered or, on the verge of being lost with the whole migration, economic situation and all of that. And then not being new speakers, myself inclusive. So I don't know how to start that conversation even within the community. So they see the importance of language documentation because we do not have even an orthography for the language as we speak.
that is a really great question. So, obviously, my first answer is going to be talk to the mentors. I think especially Paya Sakumbu would be a really good person to talk to about that. Just sort of the general question of how do you get people interested in language? I think Eula would also be a wonderful person to talk to about that. She's done a lot of work, just kind of like getting folks in her community interested in all of this language work. But the first thing I might recommend is just to start having conversations wherever you can with people about language in a general sense, right? If you're like, I don't know, if you're buying stuff at the store, just strike up a conversation with somebody at the store, like, so what do you think about language? Obviously not that question, but like, do you talk to your kids in our language, or what language do you use at the market, right? Just start having conversations and listen to what people are saying, because that will start giving you a lot of insight into where people are in their relationships with your languages. And from there, you can start thinking about what is it that people might value most about our language? What are their fears? What are their concerns? And how do I shape these conversations in ways that might generate some enthusiasm, some desire to do work for our languages? But that's a bigger conversation that's really specific to your community. So definitely chat with any of the mentors. I think they'll all have great insights. Um,
All right, thank you, Anna. I've
yeah,
actually booked an appointment with one of the mentors, and hopefully I get my answers. And then the
awesome.
next step, what I can do. Thank you.
Great. Oh, and the other thing that I would recommend on the new ELP website, there's a section called Stories, and it's articles and videos from people in different communities all over the world about their own experiences, their own communities. And I think learning about what sorts of conversations are happening, how people talk and think about their languages in other communities can be really beneficial for figuring out how to talk about language in your own context. So check out the stories, definitely. Next up, and I think we'll do probably like three more questions because I don't want to keep y'all here forever. But next up I saw, okay, I'm gonna try Bonovi.
You got the pronunciation quite well. Thank you very much. I am really a fan of language documentation. My PhD focused on that, and we did some work on the orthography of my language, Urhobo, spoken in Nigeria, southern Nigeria. So I would like to have the slide for tonight's presentation. I don't know how we can access the slides because I want to really build up on documenting my language in particular, because in as much as work is ongoing, the language is facing some challenges. So I really want to get the slides and see how I can build up on what I've been doing on the language. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. And I'm so happy that you've been working in language documentation. So everybody who registered for this session, I will be emailing you a link to a shared Google Drive folder where you can find the slides, some other useful materials, some of the paper we talked about. I'm traveling for the next couple of days, but I'll send out that email and just drop stuff in as soon as I can. So don't worry, you will get it all in your inbox.
Okay, thanks so much.
Thank
Yeah,
you. Thank you.
yeah. Next hand I saw was Ritu.
Yeah, am I audible, Anna?
Yeah, I hear you.
Yeah, thank you for the informative session. Um, I wanted to circle back our discussion on the notion of endangerment, and why I ask this is from the statistical point of view. Okay. So, globally we follow the UNESCO 5 point notion of endangerment, where languages are placed on, say, the number of speakers that would be returned on the basis of the data that would be collated by the linguists. Uh, the other is that I can possibly think of is ethnologue. And in the country that I come from, in India, we have language census, which happens every 10 years. But a bigger problem there is that sometimes the number of speakers may not match with the statistical return, right? So I'm sure we may discuss this later in the sessions, like the upcoming sessions. But I wanted to understand your view about the notion of endangerment, and how are we placing a language to be called as endangered, or say vulnerable, or potentially vulnerable.
Thank you. That's a great question, and I think one that will make all the linguist nerds really happy here. So the question of how language endangerment is measured, you mentioned the ethnologue scale, as well as the UNESCO scale. ELP and the Catalog of Endangered Languages actually use a separate scale called the LEI, the Language Endangerment Index, which was developed at University of Hawaii. And I won't get too deep into it, but one of the problems with the UNESCO scale and some others is that they treat things like speaker numbers and whether a language is written and whether it can be used in government as sort of equally important to language vitality. And they also don't really provide ways to look at those things separately, right? Like the UNESCO scale kind of assumes that if you have a small number of speakers, the language also isn't written. And we know that's not true, right? These things exist independently of each other. And so the LEI sort of looks at and measures 4 different main things independently, and then sort of assesses each of them on their own, and then combines all those things together to create an endangerment assessment. So I am also happy to share the paper that explains the LEI and how it works. And I'm also going to drop a link to a page on the ELP site called About the Catalog of Endangered Languages that also gives some of the more like academic explanations of how that catalog assesses endangerment and all that stuff. So hopefully that will be useful if you're into the fine details of that stuff. Let's see. Let's do 2 more questions so that we'll only be like half an hour over our time. So Nigel and then Florence.
Hi, am I audible? Hello? Yes.
We're-
Hi, I'm Nigel. I'm from Pampanga, Philippines, and I'm currently working on the Kapampangan language. This is more of a reaffirmation of what you just discussed. I find it really important as well to to emphasize the importance of process rather than the products. I strongly believe that if we dutifully follow the process, no matter how challenging it is and all, the fruits will come out themselves. And I'm saying this because I think that's one of the critiques or the weakness of doing language documentation work. I've engaged with various linguists in the past, and one of my observations is that there's still some colonial influence in their ways of doing research. It's very extractive. It's usually very one way rather than two-way relationship. That's why I totally agree with you with how you responded with the first question on how to be how to build the relationship, and that's definitely the first step. And I would even say that um, the language documentation would even come secondary because uh, you have to want to build relationship. You have to know the people. You have to integrate with them in their everyday lives. And I think language documentation would come out naturally in there. So I'm not sure if I communicated it well, but that's all. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Nigel. Beautifully put. Yes, there is more than a little bit of colonialist extractive stuff that is still very widespread in language documentation. And I think all of us here have the honor and the privilege of trying to move up doing things. One that's rooted in relationship, one that is primarily leading language futures in the ways they is there to, contribute their time and their labor. Awesome. In ways led by the communities themselves. And then let's have one last question from Florence.
Thank you, Anna, for your insightful presentation. I've learned a lot of information on language documentation. Currently, we are working on a translation of the Bible from English to our native dialect, that is Kimarachi. Kimarachi is a Luya dialect spoken in western part of Kenya. And we realized that because of language contact and influence, this is a language that has lost most of its original terminology and also its culture because of the supremacy of a language that is a bit powerful, that is also neighboring. And given that scenario, In Kenya, we have a new curriculum that is focusing on competence-based education. And hence, within the curriculum, we have a section of recognition of indigenous languages. And so we have very limited resources for the indigenous languages spoken in Kenya and references to these languages. So I really wanted how I can get funding to try and research on stories, on songs, on proverbs, on tales, which can benefit in language preservation and also as learning materials for the children in school. And this can also help us within our project of translating the Bible. And of course, the Bible is a very powerful text when it comes to language revitalization and language preservation. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Florence. That's a great question. So the first thing I'll say is that the final week of this series does touch a little bit on funding, how to find it, what you need it for, what you can do without funding. So we'll talk about that in the last week. But at ELP, we have also been working on sort of a short list of the existing funding options that are out there for language work. That should be coming out pretty soon. Danica has been wrapping it up. It's looking great. It should be released pretty soon. But in the meantime, we also invite you to talk to any of the mentors to help you identify funding opportunities that might be fitting for your specific context, for your country, because there are different sort of sources on where in the world you are and what kind of work you're doing. So, yeah, make an appointment with any of the mentors. They'll be happy to help you sort of do some research and find what's out there. And I see a question in the chat. Who is the Canadian mentor? That is Danica. So if you want to talk about any Canada specific stuff, Danica is the one to book an appointment with. All right, I'm just checking the chat again real quick to see if there are any questions we missed. I see somebody had to go to bed because it's very late at night, so good night. And I think everybody else's questions hopefully got answered. If not, if you still have any questions about your language work, about ways forward, again, make an appointment with any of the language revitalization mentors. They are all here to help. That's what they're here for. And I will send around all the resources and slides and stuff within the next 24-ish hours. And I want to thank all of you so much for being here on the first week of this learning series. It's like maybe one of my very favorite parts of being at ELP, to get to learn with all of you and meet all these great language champions all over the world. So we will see you next week when Nathan Adamson from the University of Hawaii is going to be talking a little bit about ways to make really good audio and video recordings. So a great place to start for language documentation. So we'll see you at this same time, same link next week. And I hope all of you have a wonderful day or night or whatever it is where you are. Thanks, everybody. We'll see you next week. Take care.
Thank you.
you.
Bye.
Thank you. Thank you so much.